So the first step in talking about art composition from a point of view, is the idea of a focal point. So in this art right here, by Dimizu Pasaka, and I'm probably not getting that name correct. This is from a manga, I believe. I'm not familiar with it, but I really loved the use of a lot of different techniques here that I wanted to start to talk about. So focal point. A focal point is the element that the player is drawn to first, or the viewer is drawn to first. And generally what that means is that it's the element in the image that has the most visual weight, the most draw. And this is an important concept that you need to understand for level design, because a lot of times we are needing to be aware of where people are drawing their attention, because often we want to direct the player's attention to one thing or another. And so when we talk about composition, a lot of times we are creating compositions to inform the player of how they can act throughout the game. So let's jump right here of this example of what it means to have a focal point in a composition. So generally any sort of like well-composed scene should be focusing just on kind of one focus point at a time. And that's kind of what you're seeing right here. And at least when I look at this image, and likely when you're looking at it as well, I hope, is my eyes drawn to a number of different things here. Obviously there's this big creature right here that it's pretty difficult to ignore. We've got this young woman here staring up at the camera. And then aside from that, you've got the book here, and a lot of detail into this building right here. But I think that sort of overall where my eye is drawn to is this young woman's face. And so let's talk about that as being the focal point, because to me, her face and just her character is what has the most weight in this scene. Let's talk about what factors affect visual weight. First off, let's talk about size. Generally, things that are very large in a scene tend to draw the eye, and in this scene right here, you can see, obviously, I think the character up here sort of has the most weight if you were just talking about size alone. But we're not, so as we'll get on farther down into this, we'll talk about some other factors here at play. Perceived mass. So of course, in a video game or in a static image, we can't get out a scale or in order to sort of weigh things, but things generally have a, you get a sense by looking at something about how heavy or how massive it is. And generally things that are more massive feel like they have more importance, more visual weight. So again, I think in this image, we are looking again at this character having a lot of mass, and so still so far we're sort of looking at that as the most sort of weighty sort of object here. Another factor is spatial depth. Now, we don't really have a whole lot of spatial depth in this scene. We'll take a look at another scene later on that has a lot more spatial depth, and to kind of illustrate this point. But spatial depth, almost kind of as the inverse of something that feels massive, but spatial depth as in massive space also feels like it has a lot of weight. Detail. A lot of times when we put detail in a scene, it's communicating that there is importance, there's information to be gleaned from it. And so added detail, especially when something is more detailed than the things around it, tends to draw a lot of perceptual weight. So in this scene here, we finally get to something that the big creature up here does not have as much of. And if we look at this building right here and see how much sort of detail is in every single line, these like little tiny towers, there's so much to sort of discover here. There's a lot of detail over in this scene as well, but I think that by far sort of if we were looking at detail alone, we're sort of looking at this area. So this area has some weight to it as well. So color. So a lot of times, so in general, sort of brighter colors are going to be weightier than darker colors, and so most of the time in our scene, it's not uncommon for level designers to sort of ask the artist to be able to like place a light here or there to sort of draw the player's attention to one corner of the area, because sort of brighter colors attract attention from human beings. And then as far as color hue goes, reds, yellows tend to attract the eye a lot better than blues and greens, that sort of thing. And if you're looking at this scene right here, that definitely, we're now starting to get of like why, at least for one reason, why this is sort of attracting attention here. We've got some reds here in a lot of these sort of buildings around her. We've got some yellows in here. The less important parts of the composition, such as the character up here, are being de-emphasized by using sort of greens and blues, that sort of thing. So the most important thing here is what is expressed in sort of the reds and yellows. Now, why is red and yellow sort of more of a draw? I mean, it might be an evolutionary sort of thing, fire, blood, warmth. These things are important to us for food and survival. Is it sort of a survival instinct, maybe? Red of apple and fruit, things like that. Again, more survival food. So I'm just kind of guessing here, but by and large, and it's not by a huge amount, but yes, reds and yellows tend to be more of a draw. Familiarity also affects weight. When you're used to something, when something seems, I guess when things are unfamiliar, they tend to be scary, and they tend to, you tend to not sort of focus on them first because you're looking for sort of friendly things. And I guess the most important part of sort of familiarity, when I'm talking about familiarity, is actually in the human form. And we tend to very quickly draw, I guess, across a scene looking for people that look like us, faces that look like us. It's very easy to like look at this and you very quickly pick up her face, you pick up his face, you pick up, I guess, these skeleton faces, that sort of thing. We're very familiar with these. We've got a bunch of buildings here that maybe you've been in buildings like this, maybe you've played games that had buildings like this, but these are very familiar structures. Less familiarity here is maybe in sort of like the fence here and the feather here. More familiar things are drawing the eye, less familiar things are not. Utility is another factor that affects weight. And maybe that doesn't really have much of a use here because this is not a video game, but in a video game, you're going to be looking for objects that have use to you in gameplay. So stairs to climb, ladders to walk up. If this actually is a level here, and we were just focusing sort of on this building structure here, I'm looking at doors are drawing my eye. I can go in and out of doors. So here's some stairs. If this was a climbing game, I could look at sort of edges that I could climb. So utility draws weight. Orientation to view. So when things are sort of facing you, they tend to have more of a threat or more of an implication to your situation. And when we're looking at this scene right here, you can tell a big difference between the idea of like she is facing towards us, she is looking at us. Compare that to this character up here, which is looking slightly away, or at least their face is sort of away from us, and their attention is drawn elsewhere. There is no sort of immediate threat. They don't recognize us. This character seems to recognize us and acknowledge us. And so by our part, we also acknowledge her. Finally, and this kind of fits overall, but contrast. Contrast is a big factor in weight. So obviously, when we're talking about any of these other objects or these other sort of factors, contrast of like a small to a large size, any of these sort of fit into that. But specifically, basically, I guess a couple of other things that I haven't talked about that do come into contrast are things like spatial contrast, isolation. When something is on its own in a composition, it draws a lot more weight than things that are sort of clustered together. And then shape contrast as well. So things that like are, as you can see in this scene, round versus pointy. There's contrast to be seen, and that's why sort of like you've got a bunch of pointy shapes around here, and then you've got some round shapes, and those sort of contrast to it. So providing extra weight. If the overall scene tends to be one way, and you have something that is highly contrasting with the overall sort of scheme, that's going to have a lot of weight. So that is weight, and we're going to come back to how that sort of factors into composition later on, but let's talk about the next aspect of composition. And that is focal guides.